Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. Today's story of the day is about a dog, but not just any dog, a stray pulled from the streets of Moscow who became the first living creature sent into orbit, and the first to die there. Her name was Laika, and in 1957 she became a global icon, a martyr of Cold War science, and a symbol of both technological triumph and moral cost. She never returned to Earth, and the truth of her fate was hidden for decades. We will finish the episode with the history brief about some new history news. A quick word from our sponsors.
Every day, companies you've never heard of are making billions selling your personal information. Data brokers scrape your name, addresses, phone numbers, even details about your family and sell it without your consent. Aura fights back. Aura removes your data from broker sites, keeps it off, and alerts you if your info shows up on the dark web. You also get VPN, antivirus, and a password manager. Start your free trial today at aura.com/hidden. Protect yourself now at aura.com/hidden. That's AURA.com/hidden.
This day in history. On January 5, 1933, construction officially began on the Golden Gate Bridge. Rising over the treacherous waters of the Golden Gate Strait, the bridge was launched at the height of the Great Depression. Many doubted that it could ever be built at all, yet the project provided thousands of jobs and became a powerful symbol of American resilience and engineering ambition. On January 5, 1914, industrialist Henry Ford stunned the business world by announcing a minimum wage of $5 a day for his factory workers, more than double the typical pay at the time. The move reduced turnover, boosted productivity, and helped lay the foundation for the modern American middle class, proving that higher wages could fuel both loyalty and economic growth. Story of the day. In the fall of 1957, the Cold War wasn't just a rivalry, it was a countdown. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer competing only in ideology or military might, but for control of the future itself. The space race had begun, and everything suddenly depended on who could put something or someone into the heavens first. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite in history. It was a polished metal sphere the size of a beach ball, transmitting a steady radio pulse back to Earth. Beep, beep, beep. That's it. A sound that changed the world, however. The West was stunned. The United States was humiliated. For the first time, the Soviets seemed scientifically superior. But behind the scenes in Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted more. Not just a satellite, but a psychological victory. Sputnik 1 had stunned the world, but Sputnik 2, he insisted, had to shock it. He demanded a second launch within just 30 days. And not just another metal sphere, something alive. Something that could prove that living beings could survive spaceflight, a step toward sending humans. And so, the mission planners turned not to trained pilots or elite cosmonaut candidates, but to stray dogs wandering Moscow's streets. In today's spaceflight world, the idea of launching an unconsenting animal into a fatal orbit feels unthinkable. But then again, how do you get a consenting animal? Anyway, in the 1950s, both superpowers were using animals as test subjects. Monkeys, mice, chimpanzees, rabbits. Humanity was still learning what space was. Would the heart fail in weightlessness? Would the body suffocate without gravity? Would radiation kill instantly? The Soviets believed dogs were ideal test subjects because they were hardy, adoptable, and in the eyes of Soviet science, expendable. Stray dogs were preferred over domesticated ones because they were thought to endure hunger, cold, and stress better. Laika, a small, calm, mixed-breed female, part terrier, about 13 pounds, was selected because she was quiet, obedient, and didn't panic when confined. Her original name was Kuryevanka, or Little Curly, but the world came to know her by a different name, Laika, meaning barker. She was joined in training by two other dogs, Albina and Mushka. Albina had already survived a high-altitude rocket test and was kept as a backup. Mushka was used for equipment testing. Laika, however, was chosen for flight, in part because of temperament and in part because Albina had recently been a mother, and at least one scientist argued that she deserved to live. It was a choice made not in science but in sentiment, a reminder that even in cold systems, humans leave some fingerprints. Laika never knew she was being prepared to die, however. None of the dogs did. And in truth, neither did the public. What the world wasn't told, what even some technicians didn't fully realize, was that Sputnik 2 was never designed to come back. There was no heat shield, no re-entry plan, no recovery system. Laika was meant to orbit the Earth until she died, and then burn up in the atmosphere weeks later. Official Soviet messaging called her a passenger, not a sacrifice. They told schoolchildren that she would live happily in orbit for a week and maybe longer. In reality, scientists hoped she might survive 10 days in space. But privately, they knew that she wouldn't survive the trip home, because, well, there was no trip home. Before launch, the lead scientist on the mission, Dr. Vladimir Yazdovsky, took Laika home to play with his own children, letting her sleep on his couch. He later said, "I wanted to do something nice for her. She had so little time left to live." The Soviets were not indifferent, but they were under pressure. Premier Khrushchev wanted the launch not to advance science, but to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Laika was not only a dog, she was a deadline. Laika was sealed inside a small cabin just big enough for her to stand in, lie down, and turn. She was wired to sensors measuring her respiration, pulse, blood pressure, and movement. She wore a suit and harness that fed into a waste system. A gelatin food paste was dispensed in trays. A water system was considered too complex for orbit at the time. Sputnik 2 lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome at 3:22 a.m. on November 3, 1957. Laika's heartbeat, already elevated from stress, tripled during liftoff. She panted heavily as the rocket ascended. Once in orbit, her pulse remained at twice the normal rate, a sign of terror and overload. But after a few minutes, she calmed slightly, and her breathing slowed. Control room scientists were relieved. Maybe they thought she could last the full mission. But then something went wrong. Because of rushed engineering and lack of time for testing, the thermal control system of Sputnik 2 failed. The spacecraft's internal temperature began rising immediately, 86 Fahrenheit, then 95, and then over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Within hours, Laika was overheating, terrified, and unable to escape. She died 5 to 7 hours after launch, not peacefully after a week as reported, but from heat, panic, and stress. The world was told that she survived days in orbit and was later euthanized humanely. It was a lie repeated for 45 years. The truth was revealed only in 2002 when a senior scientist finally admitted what really happened. By then, the people who mourned her were either old or gone. For the Soviet government, Laika's mission worked exactly as intended, scientifically and politically. She became a triumph of Soviet capability, splashed across world newspapers. Posters in Moscow showed Laika sitting proudly in a space capsule. Children were taught to admire her courage. Streets and monuments were named in her honor. In the West, reactions were mixed. Sympathy, fascination, even outrage. Animal rights groups protested outside embassies. Even in 1957, the ethics were controversial. But inside the USSR, no public criticism was tolerated. The men and women who worked on Sputnik 2 carried private guilt. Dr. Oleg Gazenko, chief trainer of the space dogs, later said, "The more time passes, the more I regret it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog." Others confessed that they had knowingly sent Laika to her death, not because it was necessary, but because it was ordered. This was not science free to ask questions. This was science under a stopwatch. Laika's flight, despite its tragedy, did achieve some scientific goals. It proved that a living organism could survive launch conditions and weightlessness, at least temporarily. It also allowed monitoring of biological reactions in spaceflight, as well as advanced engineering of life support systems used in later missions. And it provided medical data used for Yuri Gagarin's human flight in 1961. In other words, Laika paved the way for the first human in space. She did not live to see it, of course, but her death was part of the stepping stones to every human spaceflight that followed. So Laika is not simply a dog in history. She's the first astronaut to die for a world she never quite understood. Now, before I let you go, I should mention that Laika was not the last dog sent into orbit. She was simply the first. Between 1957 and 1966, the Soviet Union actually launched 57 dogs into space. Some died, most returned safely. 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, became the first living beings to go into orbit and then return alive in 1960, a triumph built on Laika's sacrifice. Strelka later gave birth to puppies, one of which was gifted to Jacqueline Kennedy by Nikita Khrushchev, a strange and silent diplomatic tribute to the animal who died before them. The History Brief. Today's history brief comes from Time magazine, which reports that the U.S. Supreme Court is considering whether the Constitution requires a 12-person jury in federal criminal trials, a standard that most Americans have long taken for granted. For much of American history, the right to a jury trial meant exactly 12 jurors, a tradition inherent from English common law and then adopted by the original 13 colonies. But in 1970, the Supreme Court in Williams v. Florida ruled that the Sixth Amendment does not constitutionally require juries to consist of 12 people, opening the door for smaller juries in many criminal and civil trials. Now, fast forward to January 2026, and the justices are being asked to revisit that precedent in a case called Parada v. United States. Advocates for restoring the 12-person jury argue that when the founders wrote the Sixth Amendment, they understood a jury to be exactly 12 members, not fewer, and that anything less undermines both tradition and fairness. Supporters of the change point to historical records showing that during the founding era, fewer than 12 jurors was seen as a mark of second-class justice, especially in the shameful context of colonial slave courts, where black defendants routinely faced verdicts from panels of 3 to 5 jurors and never the full 12. Opponents argue that smaller juries can still deliver impartial justice and that the Constitution guarantees only the right to a jury trial, not a specific number of jurors. The Supreme Court previously balanced these views when it upheld the use of 6-member juries more than 5 decades ago. As the court weighs whether to take up the case and potentially overturn decades of precedent, the debate raises fundamental questions about how we understand the Constitution's jury guarantee, whether it's meant to preserve a centuries-old tradition or adapt to modern judicial practice. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and helping me make this little show a mighty success. Keep on spreading the word. If you'd like to email me, you could do so at peter@historyshortspodcast.com. You could also go visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for the History Shorts Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Patreon, or any other social media. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.